Welcome to America at its best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'm your host for today's show. So glad you guys are with us today. We launched the show a few weeks ago because we felt obligated to bring you guys some good news. Frankly, I was getting really depressed and angry and freaked out by what I was seeing in the normal news. And we know good things are happening in this network. It's exploding with impact right now because of all of the support that you guys have given for a time just like this. So thank you for being here today. Please see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. I encourage you to use it throughout the show. It's always so much more fun when you guys are engaged in asking questions throughout. Those of you who joined us last week got to hear from some of our leaders on the ground in Texas and Connecticut. Leadership is going to be even more important because we're in a time right now where people are getting arrested and fined for going to work. We're in a time right now where the government appears to have a bit of a carte blanche, if you will, to track you. It's a crazy town if we're talking about civil liberties in light of a pandemic. And that's the topic of our show today. We're going to be joined by Nick Gillespie, the editor-at-large of Reason, and Connor Boyack, the president of Liberties Institute in Utah, to dig into what our civil liberties are looking like today and what we can do to keep them. But first, let's hear from State Policy Network's CEO, Ms. Tracy Sharp, coming to us from California. How are you, Tracy?
I'm doing well, Rebecca, and thanks for that intro. This topic on civil liberties is growing in significance as a part of the fallout from the response to the coronavirus. And this network is more known for promoting economic liberty, but we've been sounding the alarm bells about this growing threat to our civil liberties. That's because we believe civil liberties and economic liberties really go together. We need them both. They're like wings of an airplane. So it's going to be a great show today.
Thanks, Tracy. And I mean, as you said, as our civil liberties are becoming snatched away, are there some specific things you're seeing right now that this network is doing about it?
Well, we're going to hear more specifics from our panelists today, but I'll name three of the top ways that we're engaging on this to do something about it. First, we're raising awareness and sounding the alarm bells. It's going to be great to hear from Nick Gillespie of Reason Magazine, who's here. State Policy Network has had a long partnership with Reason. Bob Poole used to be on the board of SPN. He's one of the early founders of Reason itself. Second, our affiliates are tenaciously pushing forward policy reforms. So Connor will spend some time talking about their success on the ground, because all of our affiliates are working across the board on policy reforms in the light of this response to the pandemic. And finally, several of the litigation centers that are housed at state think tanks are issuing what I'm calling lockdown lawsuits, which is a powerful tool for us to protect and exercise our constitutional rights.
Thank you, Tracy. Well, with that, let's turn it over to Nick Gillespie with Reason. And Nick, I can't thank you enough. I'm a huge fan of Reason. I have been since I was in my early 20s, and I stumbled upon you guys in Charleston, South Carolina, when you were a guest at a meeting that they had there. You guys are attacking this issue. Why is Reason so focused on civil liberties right now?
Well, you know, one of the things, Reason Magazine, we're journalists, so we're trying to tell stories about what's going on in real time. And I think to kind of echo what Tracy is talking about, we tend to think of economic liberty and civil liberty as somehow separate, but they're clearly different sides of the same coin. And whenever you have the government deciding, at every possible level, oftentimes contradicting one another, saying this is essential, this is non-essential, this business can operate more or less as usual, this one has to be shut down, there's going to be all kinds of real problems there. And there's going to be a ton of mayhem when it comes to civil liberties, which includes economic liberties. How do you get on with your life? So we've been following stories like in New York City, where I live, there was a 78-year-old veteran who ran a men's clothing store. If you were a clothing store, you just got shut down unless you had groceries. So I wrote about this. The Kmart, there's one of like 3 Kmarts left in the country, are in Lower Manhattan. the Kmart can run and sell clothes, but this guy's clothing store can't. He pushed back. He opened up against the law, and
That's
and
great.
invited. Yeah.
So that's one example. What are some other outrageous examples you guys have published about?
Yeah.
Because I haven't seen much. I've got a 1-year-old at home, so I'm behind on my reason reading, admittedly. And again, I'm not seeing any of this covered in mainstream media.
Well, yeah, we followed the travails of a number of hairdressers, particularly in Texas. And, I lived in Texas, so I feel like I have the right to note that Texas women love to have their hair done. But hairdressers were shut down. Again, non-essential. My hair is shaggier than it's been, probably since the Ford administration, because barbershops have been closed down. But, Texas went after hairdressers and hair salons that dared to either come privately to people's residences and do their hair or keep their stores open. It boggles the mind. More recently, Texas is kind of pulling back and saying we're not really going to prosecute people or even run the tickets on them. The third case, which I think is particularly stressing, is in Greenville, Mississippi, and this is played out in other places. On Easter, there was a church that put together a drive-in Easter service where you stayed in your cars, and even the cars were more than 6 feet apart. They were social distancing. The police still showed up and gave tickets to everybody who came to a drive-in Easter service. And it's mind-boggling on a certain level, but we need to recognize that the government is acting with almost without restraint, without real oversight right now. And it's really important to document what's going on, the type of overreach, the type of incompetency at agencies like the FDA and the CDC, and holding them accountable. And the first step of that really is telling those stories as they're happening.
So Nick, you're telling the stories now, and it's only been 8 to 10 weeks since this all started. What do you think it's going to look like a year down the road?
Yeah, it's a serious question. I mean, I think it's good that a lot of places are starting to open up, and we'll see this is, and for the State Policy Network in particular, the idea of the states as laboratories of democracy. Different regions should be doing things differently based on local resources, local issues, local problems and concerns. New York City is even different than upstate New York, much less Texas or California, Oregon, or any place else. I think what we're going to see is a troubling, a shutdown of the economy, partly that will linger much longer. There is no switch that can turn on the economy. There was a switch more or less that could turn it off. I worry in particular, looking down the road of what is the effect on younger Americans in particular, because they have grown up. I have sons 26 and 18. They grew up with 9/11. They grew up with the economic crisis. They've grown up now with this. How does that affect their minds and what they think about? And one of the other things that Reason is trying to do is not just document government excess, government overreach and whatnot, but also the ways in which private businesses, private entities, philanthropies are working around to come up with ways to normalize life or get things back. So we're doing things like following a woman at Stanford who has put together a track and trace app that is completely voluntary, that respects privacy, and would allow us to go about our business and know if we actually were in contact with people who were infected, then we can go to the doctor, we can choose our level of risk, we can quarantine, things like that.
I love, Nick, how you said it's voluntary and we can choose. That's
exactly.
Incredible. Let me take you back to, go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
I was just going to say, when this all started, everybody was saying, and there were headlines to this effect, there are no libertarians in a pandemic. Pretty quickly, it became clear that it makes sense to be libertarian in a pandemic because a lot of rules and regulations don't make sense. And we need innovation and a discovery process to figure out how to get back to better health. And that's only going to happen through experimentation.
Rebecca, if I could chime in, Nick and I, we both have kids in their 20s. I have 2 sons in their 20s, and my youngest son has been home with us for the last 8 weeks, the longest he's been home in all 4 years. He's been away at college, and we've had some great conversations about the pandemic, the response to the pandemic, what that means. And his main concern isn't so much about the virus, but it's concerns about his future, such as his job prospects. He's very close to graduating, and civil liberties have not been as big a worry for him. And I suspect that's common in that generation. But as we talk, he does acknowledge that it's a slippery slope, and it's very hard to dial back government intrusion, this surveillance state, once it's set in motion. So I was glad to hear about the voluntary tracing.
That's really key, and in assessing risk. I mean, if anybody ever worries that a shocking incident has a long-lasting effect, remember that the next time you're standing in line for the TSA, and that's going to be multiplied throughout all sorts of ways. This has allowed the state to flex in small and big ways that we'll be digging out from for months, if not years to come. And we need to be conscious of that and push back. I think this is a teachable moment for younger Americans to understand, good government is limited, it's effective, it's efficient, and it's transparent. We need to make sure that we don't, enter a new phase where we just kind of allow the government to dictate terms of business and terms of everyday life.
Let me ask you this. So we all know that, and I would imagine that your children and Tracy's have had a certain upbringing that has helped them view the world a certain way. But if you're thinking about the masses and these kids that are in their 20s or late teens about to go to college, if you had to make a prediction of how this pandemic moving through this phase of life through the pandemic would impact their worldview in terms of thinking, hey, more government's going to be better because it keeps me safe, or hey, it's my individual responsibility to take this on, where do you guys see them landing in their adulthood years?
Well, you know what? I don't know where they're going to land. I do think there's a lot of people who are fed up with the idea of the nanny state, and younger people all the more so. Young people are not particularly at high risk here. They should be allowed to go about their life as much as possible. And I think what we need to do is give them not only stories about that, but the intellectual and philosophical framework that says, it's not wrong to want to live your life and to pursue happiness on your own terms. These are good people. They'll do the right thing. Very few people are being irresponsible right now. And I think the important thing is not to make them feel bad about wanting to have a future that's closer to their terms rather than, something that might work for a Donald Trump or a Joe Biden or an 80-year-old. This is their world and it's their future, and we need to give it as much of that to them as possible.
Yeah. Well, and so to that point, we had a question from Martin Payer. Martin, thanks for being back on the show. Martin wanted to know, Nick, how we promote what he called intelligent socializing in this environment, which I take to mean, it's on you to not be irresponsible in public. How do we get there?
Yeah, well, this is the woman I mentioned, Tina White at Stanford, has a group called COVID Watch. This is one instance where it's a voluntary app, and like you learn whether or not you've been in contact with people who have tested positive. And then you can, once you have that kind of information, you can kind of move around the world intelligently and responsibly. I think there are other ways to do things too. We've seen, one of the benefits of the current moment, if there is such, if there are any benefits, is it sped up the adoption of a lot of kind of online kind of attitudes about socializing, about work, about education that have really been being promoted since the mid-90s, but we never quite got off our butts to actually take advantage of a lot of virtual community building and things like that. So, I think the mix of that, of giving people good information and kind of guidelines or best practices on what to do, and then urging them to seek out people who think like them. We can do that now, even if we're socially isolating or distancing. And I think that'll yield good results.
That's great. All right. Final question, Nick. This is coming from Andrew Collins. Andrew, thanks for joining the show today. Nick, where do you most fear a lasting loss of civil liberties due to the government's response to COVID-19?
I think it's the build out of a kind of medical surveillance state, because, what we're talking about now is in some of the more top-down programs about tracking and tracing and things like that, it's really building in, a kind of understanding that the government will have access to your medical records in all sorts of big and small ways, and that they'll start defining certain types of people as problematic or potentially problematic and whatnot. And I think if you think about it more generally, we've been criminalizing or pathologizing a lot of behaviors and a lot of attitudes in young boys, they become hyperactive and they need to be put on, various kinds of drugs or whatever. But you get that broader and broader with more kind of expansive surveillance powers in the name of medicine and in the name of public health. I think that's potentially really, really dangerous. It's what we recoil from when we see stories coming out of communist China. But, part of us is like, oh, well, that would be good to know if we could nip all of these infections in the bud. I think that's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, me too. All right, Nick, thank you. And if you've got questions for Nick, please, again, reminder, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. Well, we will move on for a few minutes to our next guest, Connor Boyack. Connor, president of Libertas in Utah. Thank you for being with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, now, Connor, let's just get right to it. Can you tell us how civil liberties are being ignored or taken away in the state of Utah?
Well, it's funny. Just the other day, my wife and I went to the restaurant. Our state is starting to reopen, and we looked across the table at one another. We're like, oh, man, this is what freedom feels like. It's been a few weeks since we could, just even go out and eat. We've been quarantined. And we had this notion that, quarantine is for sick people. So we haven't really been under quarantine. We've almost been under this lockdown where those of us who are healthy and should be free are prevented from doing so. We've really seen this expansion of laws that have been put in place decades, even centuries ago, in terms of empowering mayors, county officials, governors, in the case of a public health crisis, to just broadly shut things down. They have just supreme authority almost, with very few checks and balances. So one thing that we've been doing in particular is making sure that the executive branch has some alternative viewpoints rather than being surrounded by yes men, so that they can really articulate and understand what these problems are and have some of those checks and balances and oversight. And now working with our legislature in special session, trying to legislatively restrict and put boundaries around what these executive branch powers can be.
That's great, Connor. I imagine that while you were eating that you must have mentioned to your wife that perhaps you and your staff are part of the reason why your state had opened up and you were able to go have dinner. So yay, that's exciting. So tell me a little bit more specifically about some of the reforms that Libertas has put forth to help, keep your civil liberties and get through this crisis.
Well, so technology is great. We're using technology right now, even under this, lockdown, to keep in touch. But technology in the hands of government has to be restrained, because what we've seen over the years, we have been one of the SPN think tanks that's kind of been on the forefront of working in civil liberties and technology. And what you see is, as these new technologies come out, facial recognition, artificial intelligence, DNA, law enforcement often avails itself of these new technologies because, hey, we can solve crimes more easily, we can catch more bad guys. But legislatures and certainly the courts are often very slow to catch up. They're slow to regulate, to restrict. And in theory, we have the Fourth Amendment, yet Justice Alito himself said, it's wrong to look to the Supreme Court for making sure that new technologies keep up with the Fourth Amendment. He specifically said that state legislatures are in a better position to adapt and react to these new technologies, which is, from our vantage point, and I think for the broader network, kind of this clarion call from the court itself to say this balance between technology and privacy, protecting civil liberties, really is under the purview of the state legislature. So, for example, last year we won SPN's biggest win award at the last annual meeting for a comprehensive data privacy law that we put together, which is really well suited to what we're happening right now, because the government agencies are scooping up all this data. They're surveilling people, they're collecting the data, whether tracking.
And I imagine that your experience in getting to that win was helpful when your governor was trying to track people coming in and out of the state, and you guys then were set up in order to find a line that's not quite so erring on the side of government stealing information from the public. Is that right?
It's been very helpful to be positioned as kind of that leading authority in the state when it comes to civil liberties and tech and privacy, because as you note, our governor instituted this program where they were using the kind of the Amber Alert emergency system, where every time someone was coming in Utah, they wanted to broadcast directly to your phone, not like a text message, nice sound, but that really annoying wake you up at 3 a.m. sound, and say, hey, we want you to fill out this information, tell us where you've been, if you're sick, who you are, what your health status is. And the big problem is people who lived in border communities, the technology wasn't refined enough to know who was actually coming in. So you had grandma driving down to Walmart in a border town and her phone was lighting up like a dozen times with these alerts. And so we were able to help get the executive branch to scale that back, put a stop to it. and try and pursue some of what Nick was talking about, these more voluntary based track and trace methods so that we can focus on specifically who the problem is rather than doing these broad technology and tools that implicate people's privacy and really put us all at risk.
That's great. What other ways are you seeing technology being used in Utah to take away civil liberties?
What we've seen around the country actually is a number of jurisdictions using drones, for example, to try and take people's temperature remotely, to shame people, for example, to fly around parks and broadcast to people and say, you're not sufficiently social distancing. Again, this new exciting technology in the hands of the government. But several years ago, we got the country's first very restrictive drone policy put in place where our law enforcement is now limited. So they're not really harassing people and badgering people and recording people. And so that's another demonstration of being a little bit proactive so that when times like these come around, the government has boundaries within which they have to operate. We even saw a video the other day of, this was in a different country, fortunately, but I think we'll see it in America soon, one of those like robotic dogs walking through a park, basically barking at people saying, separate, you must separate. And it's something out of like dystopian fiction, and yet we're starting to see these new technologies be used. Facial recognition is another one that's been used in Utah and elsewhere, using our social media photos, our driver license photos. And so a lot of these technologies can be a great blessing to certainly the government and going after bad guys, the private sector certainly, but if we do not step up and get our legislatures to be putting boundaries around this, I think there's going to be a lot of problems.
And you've already been successful in some of those areas in light of the COVID crisis. Talk to us a little bit about that and about moving forward where you see your solutions making an impact.
So on the civil liberties front, there's a number of examples. For example, there were several counties that instituted orders saying that 10 or more people could not congregate at all. This was early on in the process, I think mid-March. And here in Utah, we like our big families, lots of kids. And you had families of more than 10, and suddenly they were literally criminals subject to a Class B misdemeanor. And so we were able to work with some county attorneys and get them to publicly say, we're not going to enforce this. This is wrong. That led to the county legislative bodies kind of repealing and replacing those orders more constitutionally, passing new orders that were more constitutionally sound and narrow. For me, the biggest takeaway in a lot of this is those of us who are familiar with the criminal system know that we have a presumption of innocence, right? We're presumed innocent until the government proves us guilty. The biggest problem I think I've seen for our civil liberties during this era, and I think it's something that groups like ours really need to step up and respond to, is that in a health context, it's almost as if we are presumed guilty until we're proven innocent. It's presumed that we all have COVID, therefore we have to shut everything down, treat it like a sledgehammer, go after everyone, rather than treating it with a scalpel, right? And narrowly saying, oh, we know that this person is sick, so let's quarantine them. That's why these voluntary contact tracing methods are far superior, because it empowers us to make smart decisions for ourselves. It empowers the government to narrowly focus on where the problem actually is, rather than just presuming that everyone is this asymptomatic carrier. Therefore, we just need to shut everything down, close everything down. And that, I think, is where we need to step up and make sure the laws reflect that, and that the government is making sure that our individual liberties are protected, and that there's a presumption of innocence or health innocence when it comes to these pandemics in the future.
Yeah, I love that. Healthy until proven sick. Now, Connor, Libertas has always been exceptional in terms of your work on data privacy. And you don't just have something live and die in Utah. You work with SPN to make sure that your solutions make a national impact and go to other states. So how do you see some of the work you're doing right now spreading across the country?
So the data privacy law I mentioned earlier, we've actually been working with several SPN partners trying to get them to adopt that in their legislative sessions. And so next year we plan to have at least 10 or more states taking up that data privacy law, responding to Justice Alito's call for the state legislatures to really get involved. The same thing with the drone policy as well. And then just last week, we actually announced a new Privacy Protection Act, compiling a lot of what we've learned during this process. This would be a first in the nation process, so that any use of government technology that can invade our privacy has to kind of go through a steering committee of experts to review it first and say, rather than the government just going and using whatever they want, and then after the fact, we try and catch up, we object, reporters like Nick at Reason can say, hey, that's a problem. Instead, let's try and be a little more proactive and analyze what they want to use first to see if it strikes that balance between privacy and security. And so that's something that we're going to be proposing to our legislature in the coming year and then exporting to other states as well.
Good. All right, Connor, we've got a question for you from Debbie Gate. Hey, Debbie, thanks for tuning in. Debbie wants to know, Connor, what you think the role of state government should have been in the pandemic if we could do this all over again.
I love that question. If we could rewind and redo this all over again, you know, and we were asked that. It's like, okay, if you were the governor, what would you do? And I think it's incumbent upon us to not just say no to things, not just object. We have to have things that we can say yes to and do that. It's tough, right? We don't want to armchair quarterback and say, you did it all wrong. I think several governors are doing their best. They're hearing from experts who often are misinformed. But I think looking back, what would have been better is more what Nick was saying. Let's inform people. Let's offer as much information as we can. Let's have government use these CDC experts and others to say, here's what we're seeing. Beware, right? Use your own knowledge. If you're an elderly person with a respiratory problem, you're probably going to want to stay at home, and let's get you the support you need if you don't have a support network. The rest of you, if you're low risk, you know, don't go near old folks' homes and don't, you know, go near people who are at high risk. But I think the government would be better as an information provider rather than an arbiter for everyone to have to act based on what they think. It's the fatal conceit of central planning when a few people think they know, you know, what the rest of us can and should be doing. And we're going to see a lot of these corollary problems right now. We're already seeing them with suicide hotline calls, domestic violence calls. They're saving lives maybe on the coronavirus front, but in exchange, you have those unintended consequences starting to creep up. So I think the government's role, looking back, if we could recreate this or redo this, is give us as much information as possible and let us choose for ourselves what we want to assume in terms of risk.
I'm assuming you mean consistent information, not confusing, contrary information.
That would be ideal, but you know, this is government we're talking about, so you ask too much.
Now, before we go to the questions from the audience and bring Nick back, I can't let you leave this conversation, Connor, without asking you about the Tuttle Twins. And for those of you who aren't aware, Connor has authored a series of children's books, and they're all centered around freedom and free markets. Great gift idea if you guys are looking for some. Now, with children out of school and parents trying to teach their kids something new, I gotta ask, have sales spiked?
Sales have spiked, actually. We've got all these homeschoolers or crisis schoolers now. We've actually had sales close to double in the past few weeks. I've actually had to hire more people to help because we do all the fulfillment ourselves. It's also led me to reconsider what the next book is going to be. So right now I'm thinking that our next book will be based off of a book by Bob Higgs called Crisis and Leviathan, written back in the 80s, all about how during times of crisis, we're scared. We look to the strongman government who has all the answers, supposedly, and save us, protect us. And he talked about this ratcheting effect. Nick talked about it with the TSA, right? It's this new normal. When something bad happens, the government expands, but it never contracts. And I really liked how Nick said this is a teachable moment for a lot of us. I totally agree. And that's why I think our next Tuttle Twins book will be kind of on this issue, because I don't think this teachable moment is going to end in the next few weeks. And so by the time fall rolls around, we get our next Tuttle Twins book out, I think it's still going to be that teachable moment. So parents and children can really kind of dig into some of the problems with when we're scared, how does government grow and what should we do about it?
Great. Thank you, Connor. Okay, let's move into some questions from the audience. All right, so the first one, and I'm going to put this out there for Tracy and Connor and Nick. All of you guys chime in if you've got some opinions. The first is from Ed Johnson. Ed, great to have you back. Ed says, the state and federal governments have curtailed our liberties for a moving target. Can we reclaim the liberties that we've already lost? And if so, how? Great question. Connor, you look like you've got it. Oh, sorry, Tracy, go ahead.
I'll start, but then, yeah, I defer to our panelists. But for sure, it's like I said earlier, it's a slippery slope. But this is where the hammer of carefully crafted litigation, cases with good facts, can make a difference. Also, some in the network are already looking at policy reforms that will thoughtfully restrict the use of executive orders and emergency actions that unnecessarily imperil civil liberties. So there's some policy reform, some preemptive work that different affiliates are looking into now to help us if and when, I think it's a matter of when something like this comes up again, we don't lose civil liberties as fast. This the response was stunningly fast in terms of all of us back on our heels. So I think there's preemptive work we can do in addition to litigation.
If I can add to that, part of, and I think the question gets at this, part of the solution is to call out what's been going on. We were originally told that we needed to flatten the curve, and that's why we were self-isolating and quarantining. And, the idea of that is to spread out the number of deaths, essentially, or the number of hospitalizations, so the medical system can kind of swallow, what's going on. We accomplished that, and now the way people talk now is that the goal of public health is not to have anyone get infected. And if we're doing that absent a vaccine or absent a series of treatments that work, we're stuck where we are now forever for the foreseeable future. And it's not even clear whether or not there will be a vaccine eventually available or a treatment. We need to call out that switching, the kind of changing, moving of the goalposts, and start talking about what are the implications of that. And again, we have, at this point, a sense that the infection rate, the infection fatality rate of the people who get the disease, it will be somewhere between about 0.6% and maybe 1%. What are the implications of that? And then how do we open up the economy and open up our lives to the people at the lowest risk, so that they can go about their business? And then how do we teach people what are the different levels of risk as you get older, as you get sicker, and what are you comfortable with doing? So I think that's a big part of it, but I love the idea of the actual litigation and of other types of things that the state policy think tanks are actually pursuing right away.
Running a think tank, let me offer a brief answer. I'm actually really optimistic about our case for reform in the wake of COVID, and here's why. So often what our groups work on affects a narrow subset of the population, and we look to folks like Reason or our own think tanks to share those stories and say, hey, we want to make you aware of all these things happening to these people over here. Please help us help them. This is a unique situation where everyone feels what's going on. Everyone understands the problem. The storytelling is all around us. It's going to resonate for a long time. And that's why I think we're always going to be able to point back to this issue where people are going to have that recognition of, oh yeah, that was wrong. And oh yeah, when that executive order allowed telehealth, how great that was because I could finally use telehealth. We're going to have so many stories that people are going to identify with. And so I think there's a very large silver lining on this very dark cloud that is going to present a lot of opportunity for reform if we take up the case.
Thanks, guys. Okay, next question. Nick, this one's for you in particular. What kind of trends are you seeing in civil liberties violations, and are any groups being targeted more than others?
That's a fair question. The one thing I think we saw originally and early on was an overreaction by the police on things like public transit and whatnot. There was footage that came out of Philadelphia in particular of people being dragged off of buses and occasionally subways for not wearing masks and things like that. And what it showcased more than anything was a vast overreaction. It's a problem. If you should be wearing some kind of, it's decided you should be wearing a mask in certain types of situations and you're not doing that, that presents a problem. But when you have 10 or 12 cops pulling somebody off of something and kind of beating them or tasing them and things like that, it puts into relief, what we're talking about here is the police power of the state to force you to do things that, may not even be in anybody's best interest. So over time, we've been seeing a keener and keener appreciation for the ways that policies that are designed to, make society work more smoothly end up affecting people disproportionately. The drug war is a big example of this. And I think with what is teachable, let's say with the COVID-19 situation is that I think as Connor was saying, this is something that is affecting everybody. And so when it's a hairdresser or a men's clothing store owner or a pastor of a church who's providing a drive-in service is getting harassed, is getting ticketed, is getting arrested, suddenly everybody starts looking at the Bill of Rights and starting to tally up which ones are their favorite. So I think in that sense, this is, this can be a positive development.
Pretty awesome. Yes. And, we had another question just as you were talking about people getting pulled off of subways for not wearing masks. Warren Boulette has asked all of you guys, why can't we err on the side of just holding individuals responsible for their own health? what would that look like? You guys, what are your thoughts on that?
I'll maybe chime in briefly. I wrote a book a few years ago called Feardom, and it's all about how politicians and the media exploit our emotions in order to consolidate power. And it was kind of sad when I wrote the book, because on the one hand, I'm like, this is great for marketing because this stuff happens all the time and this book will always continue to be evergreen and sell. And on the other hand, as a kind of reform advocate, that was also depressing. I'm like, this stuff always happens and we never learn. And so I think we're seeing that too. I very much sympathize with this idea of why can't we just empower individuals to make these choices? But I think the historical pattern is clear that we deal with people who have very limited information. They don't know what the experts supposedly know. We defer to them, and naturally they tell us that we need to, behave in this way, and so we comply. I think the more this happens, hopefully, especially in a social media information age, we can get those stories out about the abuses so that we can learn from the past so as not to repeat it in the future. But it is an area where I think as social creatures, we often fail to kind of maintain our freedoms and stand up for our rights in times of crisis. And I think that's a great opportunity for us to do more storytelling and rally the troops, if you will, to that cause.
Yeah, and Connor, I was having this conversation actually with someone recently, and the person said, well, you can't do that. You can't leave it up to the individual, because you've always got that guy who before COVID would sneeze and not cover his mouth and is now continuing to sneeze and not cover his mouth. What do you do about those people?
This is a great question. So we've been talking with some elected officials about precisely this, and here's how I've portrayed the question. If this is the appropriate response for COVID, but not for the flu, and I concede that COVID is worse than the flu, then what about COVID divided by 2? Does that mean if something in the future is half as bad as COVID, that we should have half of a shutdown? Or what is that spectrum within which these policy solutions are appropriate for the level of threat? There are always people who are sneezing. There's people who don't get vaccinated. There's people who, are contagious, and life is full of risks. Drive on the street, right? You might get hit from someone else. We are comfortable to at least some extent, at least we used to be comfortable with assuming risk in order to go out about our daily life. And so the questions that we've been trying to ask policymakers is we need to have a better understanding about what that appropriate level of government response is relative to the risk. This is more born out of everyone's scared. This was a new threat. It's like when ISIS sprung up. All of a sudden, oh, it's a new boogeyman, so let's have all these policies. Or the underwear bomber, let's have the TSA, put their fingers down our pants now. It's these like fearful responses where this is a new threat and we can't quantify it. Driving on the road is a very common threat. We don't even think about it. And so I think we almost have to get used to COVID and used to pandemics, in the sense that we need to find that rebalance where it's just part of the equation of life, where people are going to sneeze and they're idiots and we don't like that. But that's not a reason to, shut their business down and make them lose their job.
Yeah.
We can also empower businesses and individuals to respond more forcefully. Businesses can set their the terms of entering their store in a more kind of transparent and open way, and maybe a more forceful way. It's not all going to be, not everybody's going to agree with me. I tend to have not surprising, I guess, I have a pretty laissez-faire approach to a lot of this, and I think that most of the threat has been overblown. But, stores are going to be sharper about saying, don't come in here if you don't do this, that, and the other thing. And again, I think, making transparent the fact we all have to take responsibility for our lives, for our own education, for our healthcare, for our retirement, whether or not the government says it's going to do that. This is merely forcing us to confront the idea that we are, we're the captains of our own lives. And let's take that seriously, and let's teach our children, what that means as well.
Yeah, Rebecca, Connor mentioned driving on the roads. Heather McDonald and others have brought up this example of the speed limit, right? We could cut in half the number of highway fatalities by cutting the speed limit down to 25. But who wants to drive 25 miles an hour on the interstate, right? We accept that there's a certain level of risk at being able to drive 65, or in some cases, some of us drive a little faster than that, but we accept that risk.
Yes, thank you. All right.
Can I just point out to, Tracy, I'm old enough to remember, too, the shifting goalposts again. Remember, and none of you will, but when driving 55, that was supposed to be great because it would save fuel Then when that wasn't an issue anymore, then it saved lives. So we should always be conscious of the ways in which today's restriction doesn't disappear, the rationale changes. And the more we're conscious of that, I think we can say no to the original restriction and just kind of get on with our lives.
Yeah, 55. I think that was the Ford administration, gas lines. I may or may not have been alive that yet. Yeah, I was alive. But yeah, definitely a memory.
Well, listen, guys, that's hilarious. And that was way before my time. But before we close out, Nick, I've got to ask you this last question, because it's helped me to hear from you and Connor just some of the things that you guys have seen going on. And aside from what you've already shared in terms of the threat to people and the stories that you've heard, what has been like the worst attack on civil liberties that you have seen or heard about since COVID started that just made you go, ah, give us that story.
Oh, I actually think it was the way in which the healthcare system, and this was particularly true in New York City, the hospital system was commandeered almost overnight, where because they were expecting a crush of COVID-19 patients and cases, they shut down things like, elective surgery, which it makes it sound like it was just plastic surgery or something like that. It was any surgery that could be scheduled that was non-emergency surgery. And as a result, we're living in a world now where a ton of people's diagnostic and other types of procedures have been pushed off to the foreseeable future in the name of saving space and resources for COVID patients who in the end did not show up in those numbers whatsoever. We were enthralled to theoretical models that never got rebalanced with actual data. And so you now have across the country, not just in New York City, you have hospital systems that are shutting down or firing nurses and doctors because there's no demand, but they will only stay open for COVID cases. And to me, that kind of move to just, unilaterally decide what kind of medicine gets practiced, it's dangerous in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. Tracy, any parting thoughts before we go?
Well, I did have a question for the panelists. Hindsight's 2020, and this is a network that we're speaking to and really helping to equip for the future. What steps can we take now really to better prepare ourselves for when this happens again? Could we have done something different in the first weeks of when this rolled out? What kind of responses as a network do you think would have been more helpful?
I'll take a stab. So I actually came across a tweet from Edward Snowden. I think this was yesterday. And he said, if you ever wonder where we're at on the dystopia scale, consider that it's normal to believe the government is spying on you and crazy to believe that they're not. And so I had to retweet that one because I agree. Part of the challenge, I think, is that, a lot of us have been asleep at the wheel as government has been consolidating these powers, as they've been acquiring these technologies. And to some extent, in our state, with our think tank, we've been able to be a little proactive in setting some of these privacy protections in place. But we've learned a lot in seeing how the executive branch has been able to flex its muscles in times of emergency. So I think one of the critical ways moving forward from this is a legislative response to restricting the executive branch. The fortunate thing there is that in most states, there is a natural tension between the legislative branch and an executive branch. And so you would have an eager legislative branch who wants to assert their authority and say, hey, mayors, hey, governor, you stepped too far. I think we're going to see, I know in our state, we're already working on it, in other states as well, a response in the next legislative sessions to kind of refresh these very archaic executive emergency management powers that have never really been used to the extent that they have. I think that's going to set us up for a more appropriate response in the future, such that when mayors, when governors do want to issue orders, they're subject to legislative review within, for example, 1 week. For example, public health officials should not unilaterally be able to shut down businesses. They should have to have the advice and consent of the local, mayor or legislative bodies. Some of these due process and oversight measures, I think, would really restrain a lot of what we're seeing right now. And I think SPN is well suited to make sure that we're talking amongst ourselves and saying, what are the best practices? What should we be doing? What have other states done? What can we learn from? it's something that we're going to be eagerly involved in the months to come, working with our legislature to try and find that right balance.
That's is really heartening to hear, and I think it's really helpful charting a course. The other thing I would say is that we need to have our antenna up, way up, every time there's some kind of variation on a ticking time bomb scenario, because people in power, and it's going to be located in the executive branch, but they're going to be helped on by people in the media who are panic happy anyway. Anytime somebody says we need to act immediately and without any kind of oversight, we saw this in the wake of 9/11, where literally the ticking time bomb scenario was used to just kind of legitimate all kinds of civil liberties abuses that are horrific and that we're still dealing with. But at the local level and at the state level and even at the federal level, when a health authority says this is a ticking time bomb and we have to act immediately, that's always wrong. And we should always be saying, slow down a little bit, have review. And then the other thing is, and I think this is true to State Policy Network in particular, where you celebrate how different states and different people in different states are trying to do things differently. Anytime an agency or a government at any level tries to say, we have to do everything this single way, we need to recognize that that is not going to end well. One of the problems with this was when the CDC got early reports in the state of Washington about problems that were linked to coronavirus, to the novel coronavirus, the CDC stopped local health officials from using tests that had already been done in novel ways to get more information. And they said, no, you have to follow our protocols or hit the road. That's a problem. We should always be pushing to allow people to have more options to gain more knowledge and come up with new ways of doing things.
That's a great point. I appreciate that, Nick, and Connor too. I think just to wrap up, in closing, I'll follow on with that, is that we are embarking on a project of 50 states, 50 stories for the response to the pandemic. We do this across a lot of different issues because every state is different. And the stories that we pull from that really bring to life how each state can figure these problems out. It's an example. We look for examples of where American ingenuity and our problem-solving skills are working this out. We have a long history of bootstrapping in our way out of problems in this country, and we've got to continue to reinvigorate that impulse across the states. And I want to thank just our supporters that really help us make that possible. It's helped us to be able to adapt and pivot very quickly as a network to deal with this response to the pandemic that has really wreaked a lot of havoc in terms of our economic liberties and our civil liberties. I'm really pleased we could dig into this today, and I look forward to hearing more about this in the days ahead as this network does pivot some to do more work on civil liberties protections.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Connor. This has been a great show. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you, all of you who joined us this week. Hope you can come same time, same place next week, where we'll be joined by our friends at Goldwater and Mercatus to hear how they are fast-tracking some life-saving innovations. So imagine that, outside of government, they're finding ways to save lives. So we will see you then, and thanks for all you do. Bye.
Take care.